we just learned that the speed of light is finite and nothing can go faster than the speed of light. So everything that you experience, everything that you see it as it was a tiny little amount of time in the past. So how do you know that anything exists right now? What do you even mean by now? So this is the problem that comes up in Einstein's theory of special relativity. And Einstein tried to construct a notion of now in this new theory, and he failed. Every moment could be now for someone, and that includes all moments in your past, and it also includes all moments in your future.
When examined through the lens of Albert Einstein's special relativity, the idea that life might extend beyond what we define as death offers a thought-provoking perspective that challenges many traditional assumptions. Throughout history, many cultures have treated death as a definitive end, a finish line that unambiguously marks the end of life's cycle. However, the advancement of modern physics, notably through the theory of relativity, raises questions that cross religious, philosophical, and scientific boundaries. This approach does not aim to impose a dogmatic perspective or a specific belief. Instead, it intends to present scientific concepts openly and examine how these principles can expand our understanding of what is commonly referred to as life after death. Rather than supporting a purely symbolic interpretation or advocating for a strictly religious reading, the purpose is to spark an inner awakening regarding how we perceive time and existence. Historically, the conception of time as linear and absolute has accompanied humanity for centuries. In many traditions, this unyielding flow moves from the past through the present and culminates in the future with no possibility of reversal or alteration. This conviction underpins most funeral rites and traditional religious interpretations, where death marks the definitive end of a clearly defined journey. However, when Albert Einstein published the theory that would later be known as special relativity in 1905, evidence emerged that time is not absolute but relative to the observer and dependent on factors such as speed and position. One of the main implications of this theory is that it calls into question the existence of a universal now. The simultaneity of events, often taken for granted, turns out to depend on each observer's frame of reference. From this standpoint, the past, present, and future can intermingle depending on one's point of view, leading to profound consequences for how we interpret life itself. In parallel, the notion of a block universe, which is a model in which time is treated as a dimension alongside the three spatial dimensions, supports the idea that all events, whether past or future, coexist within a single, vast, four-dimensional framework. If in this interpretation, each moment is recorded in a kind of cosmic ledger, then the traditional concept of an end can be questioned. After all, if everything remains, in some form, recorded, is death really the final act of a story, or merely a transformation in our perception of continuity? The relevance of this discussion goes beyond mere intellectual curiosity. By linking spirituality with science, reflections on life after death acquire a universal character, free from denominational restrictions. Instead of treating science and spirituality as opposing forces, they can work together to shed light on existential aspects that are often overlooked. From this perspective, special relativity ceases to be just a mathematical equation and becomes a bridge to expanding human understanding of what it means to exist. Furthermore, scientists such as Leonard Susskind have discussed the principle of information conservation, positing that nothing in terms of information is ever completely lost. This principle, crucial in debates regarding the information paradox in black holes, raises surprising possibilities about the preservation of data that make up the universe and, consequently, the individual. In this way, the study of physics takes on philosophical dimensions, making it legitimate to ask whether someone's essence or vital information persists even after what we understand as physical death. This first segment of the video aims to situate the viewer within a broad context. Without adhering to fixed dogmas or unquestionable theses, the goal is to make room for questions. To what extent is the human experience limited by our linear perception of time? Could existence transcend the boundaries of birth and death, residing permanently within a broader reality? And if so, how might special relativity underpin or inspire such a vision? The answers are neither simple nor definitive. This is an investigative journey in which every scientific concept engages with profound questions about the nature of being. Rather than offering closed conclusions, the proposal is to awaken a more critical perspective, encouraging each person to reflect on how many limits are actually mental constructs and how many truly represent insurmountable boundaries. In a universe where the relativity of time is concrete, perhaps it is time to reconsider what we understand by life and death and, above all, question whether these labels truly separate distinct realities. At the dawn of civilization, time was associated with cyclical phenomena such as sunrise and sunset, the phases of the moon, or the seasons. Ancient peoples developed myths and rituals to understand the relationship between life, death, and rebirth by observing nature's cycles. Many cultures viewed death as a passage to another form of existence, be it the dwelling place of ancestors, the underworld, or celestial realms. Even so, there was a consensus that events unfolded in a fixed, irreversible sequence. With the establishment of major religions, such as Christianity in the West and Hinduism and Buddhism in the East, metaphysical aspects of the afterlife took on more defined contours. Various doctrines advocated ideas like reincarnation, resurrection, or continued existence in an afterlife, usually from a chronological perspective where a final day marked the separation of the self from the material world. In this sense, death was seen as an undeniable divider, although views differed regarding what followed. It was at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century that science began to challenge the notion of time as something absolute. About 2 centuries earlier, Isaac Newton had worked with a mathematical conception in which time flowed in a constant, unalterable manner, a kind of cosmic clock. This view prevailed until 1905, when Albert Einstein published his paper on special relativity, shaking the foundations of scientific thought. What Einstein demonstrated was that measurements of time and space depend on the observer's state of motion. In other words, what is simultaneous for someone at rest might not be so for another moving at high speed. The counterpart to this discovery was the redefinition of simultaneity. Practically speaking, there is no now that holds universally across the cosmos. Each observer, based on their position and velocity, experiences a different slice of what might be called the present. This realization paved the way for a unified spacetime concept, initially championed by Hermann Minkowski. In this theoretical framework, the temporal dimension and the 3 spatial dimensions form a 4-dimensional fabric, a kind of record where all events, past and future, are inscribed. Approaching from this perspective, the traditional view that life has a unique beginning, middle, and end becomes relativized. If the past, present, and future coexist, it is plausible to consider that death is not an extinction, but rather the conclusion of one configuration within spacetime. In this model, the story of each entity does not vanish, but remains inscribed somewhere within this vast structure. The principle of information conservation, so widely debated in contemporary physics, adds an essential element to this discussion. According to this principle, everything that happens in the universe leaves behind an informational record that is never lost, only transformed or redistributed. This idea gained traction in discussions about black holes when it was realized that the information swallowed by these cosmic objects must, in some way, remain encoded. Applying this reasoning to human existence, we might suppose that what characterizes a person, their experiences, memories, and vibrational patterns, does not entirely dissipate, even if the physical body breaks down. Naturally, this line of reasoning does not replace the well-established beliefs of various spiritual traditions. Still, it does create a bridge between physical knowledge and ancient speculations regarding continuity after death. Rather than attributing survival to mere wishes or fantasies, special relativity and information conservation provide a foundation where the persistence of the self does not seem so absurd. After all, if space-time encompasses all moments in an integrated manner, one could argue that the existence of every being is permanently inscribed. For many, viewing death as an irreversible conclusion evokes fear or resignation. However, when one considers that life may be part of a larger process in which personal information continues to exist at other levels or points within the space-time structure, an opportunity arises to rethink habits, values, and how we deal with the end. Based on the principles laid out, a conceptual core emerges that unites special relativity, the block universe, and information conservation. The key point is to understand that time is not a rigid track, but rather something subjective, shaped by each observer's experience within space-time. In other words, the linear passage from past to future exists in our perception, but it does not necessarily describe the entirety of reality. In the block universe model, which complements relativity, every event, whether perceived as past, present, or future, already has a defined place within a four-dimensional structure. Thus, the notion that something ceases to exist after a certain moment loses its force. The being, in its entirety, remains at some point within this vast cosmic block. In this reasoning, death ceases to be an event of definitive rupture and becomes a shift in perspective. For the ordinary observer, it marks the end of physical interactions, while in the context of space-time as a whole, that existence remains recorded. Furthermore, the principle of information conservation, which suggests that nothing is annihilated but only transformed, broadens the debate beyond mere sensory perception. In physical terms, this idea gained relevance when scientists analyzed the event horizon of a black hole and found that, even though the matter captured by it seems to vanish, quantum laws indicate that information can never be lost. In the context of discussing life and death, this same principle suggests that the information corresponding to each person, expressed in biochemical, neurological, and energetic patterns, would not vanish at the end of earthly existence, but would merely assume another form or location. Of course, this line of reasoning is filled with nuances and does not constitute direct proof of an immortal soul in terms of specific traditions. It is not about imposing a new belief, but about showing how scientific concepts can engage with ancient metaphysical questions, inviting a less dogmatic reflection. Science and spirituality, rather than excluding each other, can build convergent hypotheses regarding the continuity of life. Different authors, such as Brian Greene in The Fabric of the Cosmos, explore the idea that the apparent passage of time is an illusion produced by consciousness, which segments the block universe into successive slices. Thus, the self experiences each slice as a distinct moment in the present. From this viewpoint, biological death does not erase the complete sequence of all moments lived, as they continue to exist within this four-dimensional structure. For many, this notion causes discomfort because it contradicts everyday perception. However, relativity and various experiments confirm that time indeed dilates and contracts depending on motion and gravity, undermining the belief in an inviolable universal clock. Looking at the phenomenon of death from this perspective, it is possible to consider that a person's disappearance refers only to the slice that other observers extract from space-time. The person is no longer here and now, but continues to exist at another point in that four-dimensional mesh where every event persists. Add to that the conservation of information, and you have a scenario in which the essence of every being is not lost, but simply inaccessible to those confined to a different frame of reference or moment in this block. A natural consequence of this approach is a change in the way people perceive finitude. If existence is not confined to the linear trajectory from birth to death, there is room for a reinterpretation of concepts such as salvation or eternal life. Instead of linking them to religious institutions or rituals, the scientific interpretation invites self-knowledge, an inner awakening that perceives the interconnectedness of phenomena. Perhaps transcendence lies precisely in understanding that the flow of information that defines each individual persists, regardless of the point in space-time at which it is observed. Although complex, this reflection does not aim to deny subjective experiences or personal beliefs. It suggests that special relativity and its implications can support a narrative of continuity that speaks to various traditions and philosophical currents. Therefore, the conceptual core is that death, far from being a definitive boundary, can be seen as part of a larger continuity whose outline is not described solely by the categories of beginning and end. The history of the development of special relativity is marked by discoveries that shook the foundations of human thought. A crucial event was the publication of Einstein's 1905 paper, which demonstrated how the laws of electricity and magnetism, as described by Maxwell's equations, remained invariant at the speed of light, regardless of the frame of reference. In light of this, the perception of time and space as separate entities began to crumble. During the same period, experiments such as the Michelson-Morley experiment, conducted at the end of the 19th century, attempted to detect the luminiferous ether, a hypothetical substance through which light was thought to propagate. The failure to detect this ether paved the way for the notion that light does not need a medium to exist and travels at the same speed in all directions. By accepting this fact as a principle, Einstein redefined our understanding of simultaneity and challenged the idea that there could be a universally synchronized clock throughout the cosmos. A few years later, in 1908, Hermann Minkowski introduced the geometric formulation that unified space and time into a single entity known as space-time. In a famous lecture, Minkowski declared that, henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away, and only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. This declaration spurred physicists to begin viewing events as points in a four-dimensional continuum. These scientific developments culminated in intense philosophical debates, particularly throughout the 20th century. Theologians, philosophers, and scientists began questioning how relativity would relate to issues such as free will, determinism, and, by extension, death. If the universe can be seen as a static block, then all moments, birth and death, would exist simultaneously, which for many signals a form of eternity. Another decisive point was the emergence of the general theory of relativity in 1915, which extended the principles of 1905 to gravitation. Although general relativity is not the main focus of this video, it also reinforces the flexibility of temporal perception by showing how the presence of mass and energy can curve space-time, altering the flow of time for different observers. On cosmic scales, this makes it even more evident that reality can be quite different from everyday linear concepts. For those seeking an understanding of life after death, these events reveal that it is not so simple to decree that death is an absolute end. If every moment essentially continues to exist within the fabric of space-time, the discontinuity of life might be merely an interpretation made by the observer moving through this fabric. Figuratively speaking, it is as if a person's biography were written in a completed book, and we perceive only one page at a time as we read it. The principle of information conservation, which gained greater prominence in the mid-20th and 21st centuries, also contributes to this discussion by aligning quantum mechanics with the idea that nothing is ever completely lost. Several physicists, including Leonard Susskind, argued against the possibility of information being destroyed in black holes, proposing mechanisms by which information would remain preserved. If this principle applies to particles and quantum fields, why wouldn't it apply to the patterns that make up human identity? Although many of these developments seem strictly scientific, they have influenced streams of thought that seek to integrate science and spirituality. Examples include approaches that view the universe as a living system, or that emphasize the importance of understanding the human mind in quantum or relativistic terms. Although there is much speculation, the crux of the discussion remains. If there is no universal now, and if no information is ever lost, then death ceases to be the abyss that separates being from nothing. Of course, these interpretations do not enjoy universal consensus. Some scientists reject any metaphysical extrapolation from Einstein's theories, arguing that physics is confined to the realm of empirical measurements. However, the very possibility of linking relativity with life after death sparks enriching debates, encouraging creative perspectives, new hypotheses, and dialogues between fields of knowledge that once seemed incompatible. Moving beyond the theoretical realm, the ideas of special relativity and information conservation directly touch on how each individual perceives their own life and the inevitability of death. Rather than being an abstract or esoteric concept, questioning whether death might not be an absolute end can have profound impacts on how we deal with challenges, fears, and hopes. One of the most significant practical effects is the alleviation of anguish in the face of finitude. If what we call the self continues, in some form, preserved within the four-dimensional record of the universe, then the sensation of total disappearance is mitigated. Physical death would remain a real phenomenon in our experience, but it would not necessarily mean complete annihilation. Each person continues to exist at certain points in space-time, and from this perspective, parting ways is more a shift in the perceptual dynamics of observers than the obliteration of what once was. Another consequence is the invitation to reflect on personal and collective responsibility. If the information of every thought, act, and emotion is not lost, but integrated into the great fabric of the cosmos, a perspective emerges that everything has consequences. This is not a moralistic or religious argument, but rather a hypothesis based on the fact that information is a fundamental ingredient at the quantum level. Thus, thinking of life as a continuity of information can foster more conscious attitudes, since it implies that our choices leave lasting marks. In spiritual terms, special relativity and information conservation resonate with various mystical traditions and philosophical schools that assert that life does not cease at the moment the heart stops beating. Many esoteric currents, for example, speak of the persistence of consciousness in subtle dimensions, while reincarnation doctrines advocate for the transmigration of the self into new bodies. From the perspective of modern science, such statements can be interpreted as allegories for processes of informational reconfiguration. It is not a matter of proving or disproving reincarnation, but of showing that, from a relativistic standpoint, disappearing may not be the only option. Furthermore, the idea of an inner awakening mentioned at the beginning of this discussion suggests that each person is invited to recognize within themselves the nature of this continuity. Rather than relying solely on external instructions, the observer can explore, through contemplative practices or rational inquiry, whether the very experience of time is as absolute as it seems. Moments of meditation, for example, demonstrate that the sensation of the present can expand or dissolve, opening the door to a subjective understanding that the passage of time is flexible. On the other hand, caution is needed to avoid confusing the notion of informational persistence with the idea that everything remains unchanged forever. Information conservation does not mean that the same form of consciousness remains intact or manifests in the same way. Transformations occur, and what is preserved are the patterns and data, not necessarily the personal identity as we know it. Even so, this point does not diminish the fascination or the depth of the subject. One final aspect worth highlighting is the possibility that science could contribute to a constructive dialogue among people of different creeds and worldviews. By examining life after death through the lens of special relativity, the imposition of dogmas is set aside in favor of a perspective that is open to everyone, regardless of religion or philosophy. This inclusive approach can enrich debates and allow more individuals to feel at ease exploring what has long been the exclusive domain of religious traditions. After traversing the journey from the historical conception of time to the implications of relativity and the principle of information conservation, an idea emerges that existence can transcend the conventional structure of beginning and end. In this view, death does not need to be seen as the definitive turning off of the lights, but rather as a transition to another aspect of the continuity of information in a dimension different from that perceived on a daily basis. This conclusion does not intend to invalidate the multiple expressions of faith that have, over the centuries, sought to explain life after death. Instead, it signals a possible convergence between science and spirituality by demonstrating that the observed universe possesses mechanisms that weaken the notion of an absolute end. Suppose every person remains inscribed in the four-dimensional record of the cosmos, and the information that constitutes our essence is not lost. In that case, it becomes pertinent to ask, what truly defines someone's identity? This question invites an inner awakening. After all, if salvation does not necessarily reside in institutions or rituals, but in understanding the fundamental continuity outlined by the laws of nature, then each individual's effort should be directed toward expanding consciousness. At this point, spiritual traditions and scientific inquiry go hand in hand, as both encourage self-knowledge as a means of perceiving more subtle dimensions of reality. Perhaps the greatest challenge posed by special relativity is the invitation to reconsider personal dogmas and reflect on what we understand by finitude. Instead of viewing death as an insurmountable wall, it can be seen as a passage to forms of existence that go beyond traditional linearity. This understanding, although still shrouded in mysteries, carries transformative implications for society. Less fear of the end, greater responsibility for one's actions, and more openness to dialogue with people of different views. Practically speaking, it opens up the opportunity to explore states of consciousness that break through the barriers of conventional thinking. Meditation techniques, contemplation, or simply deep reflection can help one intuit, even if only rudimentarily, that the present is malleable and that our experience does not have to be limited to a fixed set of certainties. When each person perceives, even if only for a moment, the plasticity of the now, it becomes easier to accept the hypothesis that life does not end where material vision ceases. At this point in the video, the question arises, how can these discoveries be applied to everyday life? The answer lies in understanding that all real change begins with each individual's consciousness. A new way of approaching time and death can reverberate in more compassionate, curious, and fearless attitudes. Suppose every being carries within itself a fragment of information that is never lost. In that case, each interaction becomes an opportunity to create new realities and leave a legacy that never completely vanishes. For those who wish to take the next step and deepen this connection, there are practical methods of inner training. Meditation is one such method, as it helps silence mental chatter and allows one to experience firsthand that the flow of time can be perceived less exactly. Along this path, the individual learns to recognize their capacity to co-create experiences and to integrate with a greater perception of the universe. For this reason, a final call to action emerges. Discover methods and tools that facilitate access to higher states of consciousness. There are audio programs and guided meditation courses available to accelerate this process, guiding the practitioner toward inner expansion. Ultimately, the possibility of awakening to the relativity of time can be experienced firsthand. Thus, this video does not conclude the investigation with definitive answers, but rather opens doors for each person to explore their nature in a free and questioning manner. Those who choose to investigate the boundaries between science and spirituality may discover that life transcends what is imagined as the end, and that beyond the horizon of everyday perceptions, there is a universe filled with possibilities. A set of audio tools is available to assist those who feel an affinity with these themes and wish to experience divine intelligence through meditation. The link for immediate access is on the screen and in the comments. If this content resonates with you, please leave a message saying, "This made sense to me,"